All right, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from for this Trilateral Commission call. I'm Richard Fontaine, the Executive Director of the North America Group, and today's session is going to look at the political scene in the United States ahead of the big election on November 3rd. This is pretty timely for those of you who watched or have seen some of the clips of the presidential debate last night, kind of a barn burner. Megan O'Sullivan sends her best regards to everybody. She had planned to be here, but we have the happy news that she's given birth to a beautiful baby girl 2 days ago and is doing fantastic along with her daughter. So we wish her all the best there. We will have a lot of things to get into today in terms of the political scene and how things look, the polls, and of course, some thoughts on the debate last night and where things go from here. And to do all that, we're really privileged to have two analysts join us who are at the very center of political and electoral processes, really leading figures in the field. And so we're grateful to have them join us. Kristen Soltis Anderson is a pollster, a speaker, and the author of The Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America and How Republicans Can Keep Up. She co-founded Echelon Insights, an opinion research and analytics firm. She advises corporate and government leaders on polling and messaging strategy. And she's one of the foremost experts on the millennial generation. She served as an ABC News political analyst and currently as a contributor to the Fox News channel. Margie Omero is a principal at the Democratic polling firm, GBAO. She has over 20 years of experience providing strategic advice. She uses both qualitative and quantitative research, and her clients include some of the biggest brands in the world, hundreds of Democratic candidates for office, nonprofit and advocacy groups, and others. And she most recently worked on the successful campaign of Kansas Governor Laura Kelly, and she led the bipartisan team studying so-called Walmart moms, a swing voting bloc that was covered by every major news outlet. So in Kristen and Margie, we have a Republican, a Democrat, two top analysts of the political scene that's almost wholly occupying the minds of people, certainly here in Washington and beyond. So thanks first to both of you for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your time in doing so.
Thanks for having us. Yes, thank you.
As we've done with these other calls, I'll get the conversation started by asking our speakers some questions. We'll invite anyone who has a question to use the raise hand function or somehow other indicate that you have something to ask. We're going to have this on the record and recorded so that we can put this video up on YouTube as we've done with some of our other calls. So keep that in mind as you formulate your comments and questions. And let's sort of get right into things. And by way of starting, both of you are real experts on polling and how to interpret polls and things like that. And, you know, today's Real Clear Politics average has Joe Biden up by about 6 points, 49 to 43. In late October 4 years ago, in the same average, Hillary Clinton was up by more than 6 points over Donald Trump. And then, of course, we saw how things turned out on election day. So before we get into exactly what the polls say, the real question that I have for you is, can we trust what they tell us in the first place? Should we believe the polls, or is there some unknown factor that we should be ready for? And Kristen, maybe I can start with you and then go to Margie. But thank you again for joining us.
Oh, of course. It's my honor. So being a pollster, this is the busy season for us, and this is the time when we are most under the microscope because the work that we are doing is driving the national conversation about what's going to happen in this election. And of course, there are many folks who have the shadow of 2016 sort of hovering around everything when they look at the polls this time around. That 4 years ago, you had, I think the model that was the most generous to Donald Trump was 538 and still only gave him about a 29% chance of winning the presidency. So in general, there are a great number of people who, when I say I'm a pollster, they say, yeah, well, why would I trust anything that the polls say? Or I've never been called for a poll, or I don't pick up phone numbers that I don't know. And so, from that basis, say, well, I don't trust the polls. And I think folks are absolutely right to be cautiously skeptical of the polls, not just because of what happened in 2016, but because polling error and missing the mark has been part of what has happened in the polling world since it really began. In 1936, a magazine called Literary Digest projected that Alf Landon would be elected president. They surveyed their readership, and it turned out surveying the readership of a single magazine is not a great way to predict an election. Even George Gallup, once he pioneered random sampling, still encountered, we had Dewey defeats Truman. In 2012, actually, the national polls were off by a bit, overstating Mitt Romney's likelihood of winning, in part because not enough cell phones were being called. And so younger voters who lived in cities, were being systematically missed. And so every election, there is something that the polls could have done better. And it's important to understand have the pollsters gone back and fixed what was wrong last time? And I would say yes, in the case of what happened in 2016. For the most part in 2016, what was wrong in some of these state-based polls, and I separate polls of states from the national polls because the national polls were actually very accurate. They showed Hillary Clinton likely to win by about 3 points. At a national level in the popular vote, that's pretty close to what happened. It's also not how we elect presidents in the United States. So the state polls that were giving us that sort of image of what was going on were the ones that were really off. And they were largely off because of voters who don't have college degrees being missed in the sample. In past elections, if we know that gender has a big relationship with political views. We know that age has a big relationship with political views. We know that race has a relationship with political views. But prior to 2016, the relationship between whether you have a college degree and who you're voting for was more tenuous. You could get that a little bit more wrong in your survey, and it would catastrophically affect your results. 2016 was the end of that. And now pollsters who are good and are doing the right thing are making sure to account for that in their samples. So most public polls you are seeing, and again, take a buyer beware attitude, dig in a little further, make sure that the pollster is disclosing that they are doing this. But most big polls these days are looking at education level when they are building their samples. What worries me is the unknown unknowns, or the things we can't account for. There are some states like Pennsylvania where there's dramatically expanded mail-in voting, and a court ruling about how people have to submit their ballots may invalidate a number of mail-in ballots if people do not use the correct envelope inside of another envelope when they submit their ballots. As a pollster, I can project who is and is not likely to vote, but I can't project who is and is not likely to use an envelope in the way that the Pennsylvania Election Commission wants them to. So these are the things that do make me nervous and give me some pause about fully saying, yes, the polls are giving us a completely accurate picture of the election. There are still some things that are unknown to us that we're flying a bit blind on this year.
Margie, I want to go to you. Is that how you see the question of the accuracy of the polls, and also this question on that Kristen raised of mail-in ballots? I mean, in 2000, we saw what happens with one county and one state in Florida, and how that can sort of turn the election upside down for quite a while. Are we looking at the possibility of a much more widespread, drawn-out kind of process while the integrity of ballots are contested after Election Day?
Well, there are certainly a lot of complicating factors this time around, for sure. I think, I agree with Kristen that I think the polling industry has really taken a very introspective, has had a lot of introspection since 2016, changing the way people look at education, changing the way people ask education is something that we worked on as a firm that I know other folks have done as well, just making sure there are more answer categories. There in the public polling sphere, there's more state level polling than there was in 16. I think there's more thought and care. The AP has done a style guide on how to talk about polling. So there's less of like, poll shows X as the headline, or carrying, this is, pet peeve of Kristen and I, like carrying to like 2 or 3 decimal points, the results of a poll that give a sense of false precision when you're talking about, a survey. So there's been a whole lot of changes that some of them are really kind of imperceptible to people who are not following this really closely. I mean, I'm old enough to remember where people didn't even know what a pollster did, and there was no such thing as data journalism. I mean, there was, it was all interviews were done on landlines. I mean, it was really very different. Now there is a lot of coverage and thought that goes into polling, where you see newspapers that publish polls and everyone sort of jumps on them and says, why didn't you wait by education? The education crosstab on your poll shows X. I mean, there's a real lot of discussion that sometimes is not as useful, but often is really quite useful to make sure that we're all being good consumers of polling. But I think there are a couple things that are different, now when you look at the polling versus 16, in terms of what it means for what we're looking at. One is Biden is consistently up. There's less of a back and forth that we saw in 16. Biden has had a pretty consistent lead now for months. There's incredible intensity against Trump, people who feel they strongly disapprove of the job he's doing. It's almost half of the electorate. That hasn't really changed. People don't feel the same way about Biden. I think the fact that he doesn't have a lot of really strong feelings toward him is a good thing. I think people want to feel less strongly about politics for a little bit. So I think that, that's something that is clearly, it is a stable phenomenon. Now that could certainly change, of course, or all the polls could be wrong, or, there could be something that we're missing. And then the last factor is, I guess I'll euphemistically call shenanigans that will happen on election night, right? What sort of shenanigans will we see? People are now, their expectations are managed and prepared for us to have the election not be called on election night. That's another lesson, I think, in the media coverage of polls and how people use polls. I think this rush to call it, while human, people, I think you're going to have a lot of outlets try to avoid that, given everything we've learned over the last few cycles. But I am worried about how people, their trust in election integrity, period. I mean, you didn't hear the president in the debate last night really try to reassure people about that, that he was going to, accept the results of the election. He didn't really seem willing to do that. So I think that's, a real concern. It's going to be a concern that's going to vary from state to state, depending on the voting culture, depending on the partisan makeup of the legislature and the governor. So I think there's a lot to worry about. That's, you can't really go, some of those things we can't necessarily explore in polling. We'll have to kind of wait until we see, but there are still pretty large numbers of people who are worried about their votes being counted properly. And that's, that's a sign of how vulnerable we all feel in this current election climate.
Yeah, exactly. Kristen, maybe I could pick up with you on Margie mentioned the disapproval numbers for President Trump, but of course the flip side of that is the approval numbers. And his approval rating remains in sort of the low 40s, something like that, which seems a little mysterious because it's not that much lower than it's been for a lot of his tenure, but we have an out of control pandemic, millions of Americans unemployed, unrest and protests in the streets. Am I right that number just doesn't seem to move that much in response to positive and negative events? And how do
you're reading that absolutely right. The polls have barely moved as we've had an incredibly traumatic and tumultuous year, and yet there was a brief period of time around early in the pandemic when Trump's numbers improved a little bit. There was a bit of a rally around the leader effect, and you had even some Democrats saying, look, I don't like Trump, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt on this. And that has completely eroded, as you might expect. His job approval has really hovered within a very narrow band, only about from 38% to 45%, which for most presidents over history, going back to Truman, you have data on this from Gallup. They show, presidential job approval going up and down much more vigorously. Sorry, I have some light coming in my window. It's just coming through my blinds.
Yeah,
I'm trying to dodge it. So presidential job approval has been very stable considering how tumultuous things have been. This is because people have very strong feelings about Trump one way or the other, and there's very little that external events is doing at this point to move them. That's bad for Trump because right now the preponderance of evidence suggests that more people have decided against him than for him. And so he needs things like the debate last night, opportunities that maybe could change that dynamic. He needs to be taking advantage of them if he wants to be able to win, because just sort of left to its own devices, the inertia of this race is not moving in his favor whatsoever.
Yeah, and Margie, maybe I can pick up on something else that you alluded to, which is the percentage of undecided voters at this point. So 4 years ago, it looks like that number of voters who said they were undecided was about 16% or something like that. And it appears that between this point in the race and election day, that they kind of went all over the place. I mean, the numbers went for Hillary Clinton went up and then down and everything. And now it's about 7% or so. So less than half of it was 4 years ago. So if assuming that that's right and indicative, why is it that people seem to have made up their minds so much earlier this year? And does that then reduce the importance of things like the debate and the news about Trump's tax returns and things like that?
So I think there are a few things. I mean, first, when you're comparing poll to poll, everybody asks the vote question a little bit differently. Do you follow up with undecideds and say, well, toward whom do you lean? Do you give the vice presidential candidates? Do you give the third party candidates? So there's some of that kind of fluctuation. But you're right. The undecideds in a lot of these polls show a smaller undecided than in 16. And I think there's a main reason for that. You're talking about a well-defined incumbent. He is president of the United States. He is not like this sort of risky bet of somebody saying, well, I don't know. I don't think I like Hillary Clinton fairly or unfairly. And, I don't really know how I feel about this guy. I'm not sure I like him either. So I'm undecided until I can figure that out. You have someone with a very clear record who, he has had stable numbers, but those numbers have not been good. He has not been above water, meaning higher approval than disapproval since he took office. So he's been underwater basically since day one. And what you would need to do, there's always these questions like, well, what would Trump need to do to turn around? He would need to do something that he's never done before, which is reach out to people who disagree with him and try to reach out and bring people together and unify the country. He's never done that. He's never shown any opportunity, interest in doing that. Certainly didn't show any interest in doing that last night. That's him kind of saying what he wanted to say. Those were the things he wanted to talk about. And none of that was unifying. He didn't even begin with thank you for having me. This is so great. I love Ohio. He began with, I won the election, so he's shown no interest in really, bringing people together. And so, people are responding to his record and his temperament. And that's, you've seen that really, really harden. I think the issue is going to be, how do we get people to vote in this kind of uncertain new voting procedure time? You're seeing record early turnout now. That doesn't mean then that turnout is likely to be disproportionately Democratic given all the polling we've seen about who has been interested in early voting. That doesn't mean that there are going to be more Democrats. It just means that they may be moved sooner as opposed to on election day. So, I think the main thing is who gets excited, who gets motivated to vote, who gets motivated to volunteer, make phone calls, send texts, donate money. You see a huge surge in smaller dollar donations for Senate candidates in the aftermath of RBG's, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, where Senate candidates in the entire battleground, basically, anything that could remotely be considered a battleground, has been receiving a massive influx of small dollar donations that is still continuing, with campaigns talking about just sort of watching with astonishment their Act Blue counter, where they can see the donations come in in the 2 weeks since then. So that shows you saw Joe Biden have his strongest online fundraising hour last night. So there's a surge of excitement or motivation that I think reflects where the stakes are. We'll see how that translates operationally into votes.
Great. I want to ask a couple of questions that kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the broader sort of political trends in the United States and how you two interpret those things. Before I do, let me just invite folks, if you do have a question, you can use the raise hand feature and I can call on you, or you can indicate in the chat box that you'd like to ask something of one of our speakers, and we can go to you for that. But let me just zoom out, I guess, for a minute. And, you know, one of the things that I think remains a mystery, at least for some of our international members, if not our American ones as well, is this electoral college. And, you know, of course, it's the case that Hillary Clinton received almost 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, and Donald Trump became president of the United States. And that a Republican presidential candidate has won the popular vote only once since 1988. That was George W. Bush in 2004. And it looks like whatever the specific outcome of this election is, Donald Trump's chances of winning the popular vote seem vanishingly small at this point. But that's also immaterial to the outcome. And so are we looking at a circumstance where, you know, going forward, Republican really can't win the popular vote? This is all going to be a contest in the Electoral College, and therefore, you know, for the foreseeable future, any Republican that wins will win with a lesser share of the popular vote than the Democrat that he or she is running against. And maybe, Kristen, I can go to you for how you see that.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any reason why we should think that Republicans simply can't win the national popular vote. The fact that we've had a uniquely polarizing candidate for the last 2 elections has certainly made it harder. But I think you have to take a much longer view when you think about the parties in our nation and our elections. And, you know, there was plenty of talk about a permanent Republican majority early in the Bush administration, then talk about a permanent Democratic majority early in the Obama administration. So, you know, as someone who thinks a lot about generational politics and the role of young voters, I do have grave concerns for the GOP over a long enough, over the long haul, and even in the short to medium term at this point, as Republicans lose young voters, those under the age of 40 at this point, by enormous margins, especially considering that in this election, Donald Trump is also struggling with senior citizens. Normally, he's making up for his deficit with young people by doing quite well with older voters. That's not necessarily the case this time. So Republicans have big challenges long term, but I would separate that out from the question of the Electoral College. I mean, there are a lot of things at this point where there are folks that on the one hand will say norms matter, and on the other hand will say, well, let's get rid of the Electoral College, let's get rid of the filibuster, let's pack the court, et cetera. And I think these are all sort of dangerous things, you know, regardless of which side you're on, are dangerous things to mess with, and often have unintended consequences very shortly after the changes are made. You had Harry Reid get rid of the filibuster for judicial nominees, used to great effect by Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell to fill the courts with conservative judges when Donald Trump became president. So I would separate out Republicans' long-term political struggles, which I think are very real and are rooted in the party's massive difficulties they're facing with younger voters, and the fact that that image of what the GOP is going to be very locked in with a huge segment of the electorate for decades to come. But viewing that as somewhat separate from the question of the Electoral College playing a role with the GOP, because as people move from state to state, as states change, you know, 20 years ago, it would have been unfathomable that we could be talking about Texas as a swing state, and yet here we are. So 20 years from now, could we be talking about California as a swing state? It seems insane to even posit it, but these things are always in flux.
Let me just follow up on that before I go to Margie on this question of millennial voters that you just touched on. And I think you're safe to say you're the expert on millennial voters. What's the worry that you have for the GOP when it comes? I mean, when you look at the millennial generation, what are their priority issues, and why does that, in your mind, sort of portend danger for the GOP as it is today?
So there are a couple of issues. Climate change is a huge one. I was very glad Chris Wallace asked a question about that last night and tried to press Trump on it. Trump said he believes that mankind is having a role in climate change to an extent. Yes, was his wording. So we're getting there. We're slowly getting there. But that's a huge divide between sort of mainstream Republican rhetoric and younger voters. Other key issues, things like LGBT issues, very big differences between where younger voters are at and older voters. And this even represents a divide between Gen Z and millennials. On most issues, Generation Z, those born kind of mid-90s and later, are right in line with where millennials are on many issues, but on things like gender identity are even sort of more progressive than millennials are. Just sort of further widening the gap between where I think Republicans are and where younger voters are. But you also have economic issues. It's not just about sort of social, cultural hot buttons. Younger voters, I think by and large, while when we see polls showing them embracing things like socialism in higher numbers, they're not defining it necessarily as the government seizing the means of production, but there is a skepticism of markets. Even as, you know, markets and capitalism have transformed the world around them and, you know, allow them to now have these devices where they can order anything, you know, immediately, they're also looking around and going, wait a minute, I went to college, I took out all of these loans, I have tons of debt, now I'm working, my wages aren't going up, I can't afford a house, my healthcare is really expensive, and the CEO of my company is making how much money? And they're not wrong for saying that they feel like maybe the current system's not so great. And I think as long as Republicans are ineffective at making an argument for why they believe limited government and free markets are a valuable approach to ordering society and structuring the way we govern, until they begin getting good at talking about that, which has been something that they have been completely neglecting to do, and until they actually have solutions that will, besides just saying, well, let the market take care of it, that's going to be another big struggle with younger voters.
What do you make of the argument that one hears a lot on the Republican side of, well, of course they're leaning towards socialism, or of course they embrace what one might describe as more progressive views on certain things because they're young, and so you just wait them out. You know, when they get older, they'll be Republican voters, but when they're 20, 25, 30, they're not. And so, you know, time is on our side, so to speak.
I would love to think of myself as a young adult, but I am closer to 40 than I am to 20. I'm closer to 40 than I am to 30. I am a millennial. I own a home. Many people in my generation, we've owned homes, we have kids, we've done all of those things that Republican strategists have been telling me for a decade were going to make us all wake up to why we should be conservative. And that has by and large not happened. In the 2018 midterms, those who are millennials voted for Democrats by the same margin that they voted for Democrats in the 2006 midterm, which is the first midterm where millennials could like vote in any sizable numbers. The pattern has stuck. There may be time for Republicans to do better with Gen Z if they move, if they're able to sort of get their act together in time to reach that generation. But for millennials, they've had a decade or more of being aware of politics and being aware of politics in a moment when the GOP was just not where they were at. And even as they have aged, that natural evolution that some were expecting has not taken place.
Yeah. Margie, let me go to you. Anything that you want to add to that? And then I also want to ask you about women voters, where you've done really extensive research and how you see some of the priority issues there and the sort of party breakdown.
So I wish I lived in the world that Kristen envisions, where Republicans can have transformative national candidates who can win the popular vote and reach out to younger voters and appeal to women voters and people of color and LGBT and talk about climate change. Like I wish, and we just had disagreements on some of the how. I wish that was the case. I mean, it would be so much healthier and so much less nerve-wracking than what we have right now. And here's what it looks like to the left, that we can't really separate out the dysfunction that is happening in Washington from the fact that Republicans don't have a mandate for a public opinion mandate for a lot of their policies. That for a lot of folks on the left, and I'm not going to talk about the deep, yes or no on things like court expansion, but you have Republicans who don't have a mandate on things like, limiting reproductive freedom or repealing the ACA or voter suppression or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So are using the mechanics and tools of our government for, to consolidate power on their way out the door. And that there is a limitation in their ability to then be national, parties with a national broad appeal, as opposed to a dwindling pool of folks appealing to them with appeals to defend something, as opposed to be expansive and inclusive. And I don't think this is healthy for either party. I don't think it's healthy for all of us that this is the situation that we find ourselves in. So I think when people think about the Electoral College, rather than talking about we should get rid of the Electoral College, it's really about like the person with the most votes should become president. That's sort of a simple way of explaining it that a lot of people really support. And if we continue to have candidates, and if they're all of one party, I think that's even more problematic. Win the Electoral College and not the popular vote and become president time and time again, and then use that as a mandate to push through policies that also don't have popular support. I think that's going to cause, it is causing a real, fear that our government is not really aligned with where people are, and with no end to that insight. So that's where a lot of people feel. That's how a lot of people feel, when they think about what's happening with the two parties. And it means that people are thinking more about some specific democratic reforms and policy reforms than they ever did. Years ago, people did not, really think about campaign finance reform. Voters didn't. People, who work on campaigns do, but, they didn't necessarily think about a lot of this stuff. But now you see some of these things becoming part of common vernacular. Now, I guess about women, what does this mean for, women voters? I think women voters are concerned about the same things that everybody else is. The specific challenge for women voters this cycle is the extent of caregiving that is happening, the extent of, whether it's worrying about an elderly parent who they can't visit because they're in a nursing home, or feel worried about visiting, or feel far away from, and they can't, worried about traveling to visit that person, the pressures of, childcare and homeschooling, in addition to the work, and how that ends up putting a disproportionate burden on women in a way that, for some families seems to be erasing some of the egalitarian gains over the last few years or decades. And we had some poll just come out yesterday for the Omidyar network that shows that about 40% of Americans say that they or someone in their household has lost jobs or hours or wages in the last few months. And it's disproportionately people of color. Among white voters, it's disproportionately women in particular. So there's a real sense that women are feeling the real brunt of this. And you see that in the, really widening gender gap in what's happening nationally, a wide gender gap among college educated voters, a wide gender gap among, across different ethnic groups and racial groups, white women versus white men, Latinas versus Latinos, Black women versus Black men. Across the board, women are really, making their voices heard pretty loudly.
That's really interesting. Let me follow up with a specific question for you, and this, I guess, maybe in more speculative, but there's kind of two very different portrayals of Joe Biden that one hears out there. One is, that he was the most moderate Democrat in the field, unless you count maybe Bloomberg. He's been a relative centrist for most of his career. He would govern in an inclusive way if he were elected president. Picked a centrist vice presidential candidate when there were plenty of options to his left. The other is, he may be Joe Biden centrist guy, but he's really going to be a captive of the left wing of the Democratic Party, and the AOCs and the Ilhan Omars have got the kind of political momentum and are going to be able to constrain his ability to move if he is president. And those are kind of two radically different views of what people would be voting for if they voted for Joe Biden. And I wonder how you see what really is at issue here. Margie,
Go ahead, Margie.
I'm sorry. Let me ask Margie, and then Kristen, and then I have a question on the Republicans as well for Kristen. So Margie.
Yeah, it shows that the Trump campaign hasn't really landed on a clear way to draw a contrast with Joe Biden, because which is it? And if they say it's both simultaneously, that's a sign that your message is muddled. While the president, when asked what would you do with the second term, literally doesn't have a clear answer. So, the fact that he says both of those things about Joe Biden, and that's the charge, that folks have been trying to make against him, means that they haven't resolved what they want to say about him. And meanwhile, Democrats, I think there's this, both sidism that happens sometimes in the press. You don't actually see Democrats divided. Sure, there are, people with different points of view. We're a big country, but Democrats are pretty united in their support for Joe Biden. They're united in their opposition to Trump. They're united in their motivation to vote. So the sense that, Biden is, upsetting folks in the far left or is too beholden to the far left that he's, alienating the center is actually not borne out by the data where it, various kinds of Democrats from all different kinds of backgrounds and political persuasions are supporting it.
Kristen, I'd be interested in your view of sort of which Joe Biden is the one that is on the ballot, and then also your view on the future of the Republican Party, which of course is a gigantic issue. But, if Trump loses, then I guess the battle for the future of the Republican Party sort of begins immediately. If he wins, he's still a lame duck immediately. And so after, I guess, some decent interval, the battle for the future of the Republican Party's sort of political soul begins. And I wonder whether you think we're looking at a party that's more of a Mitt Romney, John McCain style approach, which seems so different than where we are today, although those were the last two nominees before Trump, or a Donald Trump type populist party with very different policy views and very different style.
So I think on the future, on the Joe Biden question, I think he's somebody who has been known in national politics for so long that trying to define him as someone who he is not has proven to be a big challenge for the Trump campaign. I don't believe that Joe Biden, in his heart of hearts, is a far left progressive. But I do think, you saw in the debate last night a kind of interesting contrast. On the one hand, he took great pains to distance himself from the left wing of his party. I am the leader of the Democratic Party. I do not support Medicare for all, trying to be real forceful. But then there were these moments where he would say, well, the Green New Deal is going to pay for itself. And then 15 seconds later would say, oh, but I don't support the Green New Deal. So there is definitely a tension between perhaps the man and those advising him around him and those who are going to be the voices of the future of his party. He talks about himself as a bridge to the next generation, and that bridge is to a further left Democratic Party. So I don't think it's wrong for Republicans who might be wobbly on Trump and considering Joe Biden to say, look, I might like Joe Biden as a person, but I worry about the presidency is not just about the presidency, it's about filling 4,000 plus vacancies of political appointees in the executive branch. It's about the ability to make appointments, et cetera, et cetera. That makes me a little nervous. So I think Joe Biden himself, trying to brand him as in any way socialist, I think is ineffective. And I think you've seen Republicans try to struggle through that. But I don't think that it means that Biden is completely immune from there being, to the extent that there are undecided voters still left out there, some concerns about, well, is this going to open the door to things that I'm not comfortable with as a more moderate swing voter? On the Republican side, if Donald Trump wins, it sort of sets in stone what has happened to the party over the last 4 years. You can no longer just chalk it up to, oh, this was a weird fluke. It was a strange election. 80,000 people vote a different way in some states. And if he wins again, if he becomes president for a second term, you can't just hand wave it away as a fluky thing. And he'll have a long-term effect, I think. He will cast a shadow over the party for decades. However, if he loses, which seems likely, my firm did a poll of Republican voters of who they would vote for in the 2024 primary, just kind of for fun. We were curious. It's not terribly serious. No one's really running at this point, et cetera. Mike Pence was in the lead, but only had about a quarter of the vote. So you can read that glass half full, glass half empty. You can read that as, if you're Mike Pence, as, hey, look, I'm in the lead in this poll. On the other hand, you're the sitting vice president. You should be the natural heir to Trump in a party that at this point, he has really good job approval among Republicans. Doesn't extend much further beyond Republicans, but Republicans these days have sort of rallied around their guy. Donald Trump Jr. comes in second in our poll at 12%, Nikki Haley 7%, Marco Rubio 5%. So this, I think, disabuses me of any notions that the future of the Republican Party is a resurgent Mitt Romney. I don't think that's likely to be the case. I do think there is a chance for the party to, moving forward, try to take to the extent that there are good things, lessons that have been learned over the last few years. For instance, the Republican Party needs to have more of a focus on the working class, that Donald Trump has improved Republican standing among at least white working class voters. Now, that's not enough, but I think to the extent that Republicans sort of get the message that you can't just be all about sort of free trade and corporate interests, that would be a very valuable lesson to take away from the Trump era, and has really caused the GOP to have to rethink some of its positions on things like foreign intervention, on things like trade, et cetera, which may have been necessary debates to have and may still have a lasting effect after Trump, even if he is unseated.
Aki Tanaka has a question. So Akiko, let me go to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kristen, Margie, for your very sophisticated analysis. I watched what you might call the debate last night. And to be frank, it was shocking. I think the two of you might have been asked, with this question already, but I would like to ask you, what kind of impact will this debate on the public's attitude? Will it change the distribution of views of the two candidates, or will it not?
Margie, you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, the conventional wisdom is that and usually doesn't really matter, that it matters less, that it's more likely to not matter than it is to matter. That occasionally there are these moments that, we recall, but ultimately, does it dramatically upend a race? And the answer is typically no. Even if it changes the news for a bit and the news coverage. So it's also not just about who watches the debate and how they're experiencing it, but what the coverage shows after the fact. And the coverage is now, you can see, it is hardening that this is Trump, unhinged, right? That and the snap polls that were done afterwards, which are not representative at all because, partisans watch it and so on, show overwhelmingly people thought that Biden won and not Trump. There was focus groups of people who were watching it, live streamed for television. And those folks said, I feel anxious. He seems terrible. He seems childish, et cetera. So does that inform the coverage in a way that is helpful to Biden? Perhaps, but I think it was so volatile and unusual that I don't feel comfortable even saying there's a prediction about it. And certainly I thought that Hillary Clinton was the stronger debater in 2016, and that did not change that outcome. He was, stalking and insulting and so on then. So, I think, and she obviously had much more mastery of the facts. So does that, so in a similar kind of scenario where Joe Biden is trying to talk about policy and remain calm, and Trump is, saying whatever comes to his mind, does that make people say, okay, well, Joe Biden has the temperament and Trump doesn't? I guess the question is, does it change people who were on the fence or who were like, well, I have always voted Republican. I kind of like Trump's policies, but I wish he wouldn't tweet so much. Just watching him kind of in action change their mind. I don't know, but it's I suppose, an important exercise for us all to see what the president's like. And he's like, exactly what you think he'd be like, but by judging everything that we've seen so far about him. But I agree, it was shocking. I had this thought, I was like, is there a way we can make sure, can we turn off this in other countries so nobody can see it? Like, somebody turn it off somewhere. I don't want to see it. And you have all these people like, okay, I'm paid to, tweeting, I'm paid to watch it. I'm like, well, no one is actually paying me to watch it, like literally do I have to watch it? Like it was just such a physical, I had such a physical experience watching it. And I know that's how a lot of people did, what a lot of people did. Maybe they won't, the ratings will be low as a result in a way that it will lessen the impact. I don't know. It's too early to say.
I think for these debates, the vast majority of people who are going to consume them are going to consume them via clips that are circulated the next day, whether that's clips online or whether that's clips that are, in their nightly news program. And so you have to think about what are the key clips out of this debate that are going to get circulated. And I think Donald Trump made a massive strategic error in not heeding. There's a Napoleon quote that has been floating in my mind the last 12 hours or so, which is the never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. There were moments in that first 10 to 15 minutes of the debate when Trump seemed like the restraints were on a little bit. He had clearly practiced his message on the Supreme Court. And it seemed as though, Trump had more energy, and maybe Biden was going to live up to this very, was going to struggle to meet this low bar that Trump had set for him. And then repeatedly, over and over, as Biden would be, kind of struggling with a sentence or trying to piece together the talking point in the void, Trump would just barge right in and would interrupt what could have been a clip that his campaign would have been able to use in an ad. So Trump's just inability to contain himself was on full display, and I think did him absolutely no favors. I don't think that Joe Biden did a great job, but I don't know how anybody could do a great job. And frankly, if this is a draw, and if this does not move many voters, or frankly is just closing off some more undecideds to Trump, that's a huge win for Biden, because there is one thing, campaigns can raise more money. They can't raise more time. Donald Trump is running out of time to change this race. And something like this debate was an opportunity for him to do so that he completely squandered because of his inability to stay on a message. In 2016, yes, Donald Trump was bullying, and yes, he was aggressive and all of the things Margie said, but he did have something coherent as his message, which was, I'm going to be a change agent, and Hillary Clinton is part of the swampy establishment, and she represents corruption, and we can't have that. That was his message, very simply. This time around, it is entirely unclear what Trump is trying to prosecute here. Is it that Joe Biden is far to the left? Is it that he's too weak? It was so all over the place that I think there's no possible way you can frame this as a Trump win. And the fact that it was so off-putting to so many, I think it means that it will have very little effect, which is good news for Joe Biden.
Margie, let me ask you about a couple of issues. The national security issues almost were non-existent in the debate last night. And, climate change was on there to some degree, Ukraine, Russia, but in a political context more than a national security one. And we see now a split, among the parties on some of these issues, Russia and China in particular, where, kind of amazingly, Republicans seem more comfortable with Russia than Democrats these days, in contrast to the traditional, view of the Soviet Union and Russia, and Republicans are much more skeptical of China and things like that. And I guess along age groups, as well, as Kristen was suggesting, with the importance that the younger generation puts on climate change in contrast to older groups. So when you look across the sort of national security issues, what do you see as the big, most salient ones to people now? I would guess that the pandemic now has suddenly become issue number one for people. But what are they worried about? What do they think is most important?
This is people are barely leaving their houses, so there are fewer people really thinking about national security issues. Ultimately, people are looking very much inward. For whether that's a good thing or bad thing, obviously that has some challenges to have that kind of focus. At the same time, I think Americans just feel everything is just so tumultuous that international national security issues seem very remote and sort of not top tier. In terms of every kind of qualitative we've done, or in looking at surveys, even in looking at what public surveys are even asking, it's lower tier just in terms of the priority of what people are covering or talking about. So you're even getting less information from that perspective. One thing that I think is interesting that we've seen in some of the polling that we've done, and this wasn't always the case. This didn't used to be the case where you could say, well, in other countries, X is happening. Americans, when you use that as a message for but we have seen some results that suggest when you say like in other countries, the pandemic is going differently than here, that is actually a stronger message than a message like that on a different topic in a different time. So I think there is some awareness that like things are going a little bit differently in other places. And so, talking about that I think is important. But again, that's different than how Americans view security issues and what's happening in other countries, separate from that, right? But it is something that I think suggests that people feel like is something unique happening to us. Why is this happening to us? And using that as a way to think about what's happening in other countries.
It's a super interesting point that you raise about the learning going from examples abroad to the United States, which, Americans are not always, let's say, at the forefront of absorbing lessons sometimes from other countries. And I was speaking recently with some of the folks that are involved in the democracy promotion organizations that support democracy abroad. And they're sort of wrestling, as you would guess, with how do you promote democracy when you have debates last night and the world's greatest democracy has somebody saying we can't even carry out a fair election, and even if we do, then I might not, respect the results of it, and all this other stuff. But the talk in a lot of these circles now is about what other countries can teach the United States about some of these specific issues, how Taiwan can provide lessons for how to effectively battle a pandemic, how South Korea can provide lessons for how to effectively hold an election amid a pandemic, how Estonia can provide lessons for how to protect your institutions from disinformation and things like that. So we may be seeing a little bit of a shift from the normal sort of messianic impulse when it comes to American democracy here, which is an interesting development. Kristen, let me go to you on that, and also just pick up the comment you made about trade, and particularly on the Republican side, the party of free trade is not today the unabashed party of free trade, and Trump has certainly changed that. And do you think that's kind of a idiosyncratic Donald Trump thing, or are you seeing a broader sense that the Republicans are more skeptical of trade in general, trade agreements and things like that, than they have been in the past?
I think this is something that's going to outlast Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump was unique in having seen that there was an appetite for changing the party's stance on trade before anybody else in that Republican primary really did. So he accurately gauged there was a market for that in the party, and that's why you've seen such a big shift on it. And I don't think it's going to go away. I don't think it was caused by Trump, and I don't think it goes away even if Trump is unseated. I really believe, and I wrote a column about this a couple of months ago, that the 2024 Republican primary is going to be fought in large part around the axis of who is toughest on China. You're already beginning to see this with, there's the House China Task Force and folks from Josh Hawley to Tom Cotton to, a variety of folks in the Senate who may have their eyes on things. Really taking very vocal stances, pushing back against things like TikTok, pushing back against things like the NBA, pushing back against, Disney over Mulan. You've seen this become a real kind of cause celeb in conservative circles, talking about the plight of the Uyghurs, et cetera. And I think COVID has made very personal for people what might have otherwise been a more, as Margie mentioned, we're in a moment where people are looking inward, they're not looking outward. But it's also unmistakable that the pandemic came from somewhere, that we had bad information at the beginning of it, and that has set America up in a bad position for dealing with this in the early days. And I think you're going to see tons of clips of Tom Cotton in January and February bringing this up in hearings in the Senate, you are going to have every Republican trying to tout their anti-China or tough on China bona fides. And I think this is going to be something that will persist, again, regardless of what happens with Donald Trump as we move toward 2024.
And Leonard Levy will give the last question since we're coming on the hour here. And he asks how you expect the mail-in ballots to influence total voter turnout and what the implications are for the election outcome. So Kristen, you want to take that on, and then we'll go to Margie and give you the last word on this, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. So I suspect turnout in this election is going to be incredibly high. And actually, Margie, I apologize if I'm stealing this line from you, but I heard someone say once that people are going to crawl across broken glass to vote in this election. Or at least progressives will, the Democrats will, that they're so fired up to unseat Donald Trump that a pandemic will not stop them. And so
we have a lot of those metaphors and imagery on the left, so, like the, so it wasn't me, but we all have our favorite, like 10 versions of that line.
So we're likely to see incredibly high turnout. What worries me is, I go back to, there are going to be some states, like I love talking about my home state of Florida because people make fun of it, but I think Florida is fantastic. Florida is likely to be a state that is going to count ballots properly and competently, and we will have results out of Florida on election night. They have policies in place where ballots have to be in on election day. They're counting them ahead of time. So this is not going to be some long drawn out process like you see in places like California, where a race might look one way on election night and then 3 weeks later it changes. I think people's expectations have been shifted, so they know we may not have complete clarity on election night, although if it's a Biden blowout, we probably will still have complete clarity. But nonetheless, I worry about states like Pennsylvania, where if it comes down to a state like Pennsylvania, there are 100 different things that could all go wrong, not dealing with fraud or malice or suppression, but just dealing with the logistics of spinning up a complicated new expanded mail-in vote system to an electorate that in the weeks before an election with very little opportunity to test it, except in these primaries where things have not gone completely swimmingly. So this does make me nervous. I think we're likely to have very high turnout, and we're likely to see mail-in ballots be overwhelmingly cast by Democrats, where you heard the president in the debate last night urge his supporters to vote in person. But if you wind up with any sizable percentage of mail-in ballots being thrown out, again, not through fraud or suppression, but just because they were filled out incorrectly or what have you, that could be very problematic and traumatic. And I think could wind up, if it's in large enough numbers, imagine 5% of mail-in ballots getting thrown out in a state like Pennsylvania. That could have a hugely negative effect on Democrats' chance of winning in that state. And that's the kind of stuff that really keeps me up at night.
Margie?
There are a lot of things that keep keeping me up at night about this election, for sure. That's one of them. And then the other thing is just people's perceptions of, the motivation behind all of this. I think people are prepared for like things to be a little bit messy, and that's unfortunate, obviously. But I think people are willing to be charitable on some of that. At the same time, there are a lot of folks, particularly Black Americans, who feel especially worried about whether or not their vote will count because of long-time history of voter suppression, because of the way, current acts of voter suppression from, folks on the right who seem to, want to discourage people from voting, who want to encourage people to, be cautious of the results, who want to take, polling locations away from, from different neighborhoods. I mean, this is not new, but it is, continuing to happen. And so I think it's important to emphasize not just mail-in voting, but absentee early voting. So you can take your absentee ballot and turn it in at a location before election day. You don't necessarily need to mail it. And that's where, the kind of layer of the, Postal Service, USPS, battle, Trump talking about defunding the Postal Service, people experiencing delays in mail kind of adds to that complication. So making sure people, have the tools and awareness and know how it works in their area to return the ballot in person is another, workaround.
Great. Well, Margie, Kristen, 5 weeks to go till the election, and the whole world will be watching, and you've done us a great service in providing your thoughts and analysis to us this morning, and so we're really grateful for you both of you doing so. So thank you on behalf of everybody in the Trilateral Commission. For the members, I would just mention, as you will have seen, we will have a conversation with Larry Summers on the economy on Wednesday, October 7th, is organized by the European group. So that will be the next call in our series coming up. And so thanks to all of the members who've joined us today and who will be watching this this recording, as we say, asynchronously, as they say about schooling in Virginia, at least. But Margie and Kristen, thanks so much for joining us this morning, and we really appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.